The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, labor advocate Celine McNicholas explains how an upcoming decision from the Supreme Court could undermine the power of public unions. Dan Maurer of the Communications Workers of America outlines how trade deals can create jobs and protect workers' rights. And Bill Press talks with Democratic strategist Adam Parkhomenko for the latest on the midterms and how much the Mueller investigation will impact them. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Celine McNicholas is an expert on labor law and an advocate for workers' rights. She explains how a recent case heard before the Supreme Court could weaken American unions. And we say hello to Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee. He previously served as legislative director for former Congressman George Mueller. Dan Maurer, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us as well. You know, the president wants to quit or substantially change the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Is that something you welcome?
Yeah, to be quite frank, the way we view it is that our trade policy, including NAFTA, has been built not to benefit American workers or workers elsewhere, but instead to benefit the interests of multinational corporations. And that's reflects how the process has gone. A lot of times these negotiations have been very secretive, and corporate insiders have had special access. And no surprise, the people with special access have gotten deals written to their benefit. What we've seen is lost jobs and lower wages as a result. So we think that it needs really a substantial rewrite to actually put the interests of workers and communities in the environment first. Whether we'll actually see that is still tough to know from my end. As you've seen, the president has not been very friendly to workers or communities or the environment in areas from healthcare to taxes to labor law to Wall Street reform and everything in between. So we hope that we do really see an effort at a rewrite that puts working families first, but we still, I think the ball remains out a little bit on that question.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had mentioned job creation or job losses. I was under the impression that NAFTA has actually created more jobs than have been lost. Is that inaccurate?
I think that is inaccurate. Yeah, I think this is a common misconception that gets pushed by people, by the same interests who like the status quo. And so they don't want to see changes that would really fix things. If you look at what we've seen about 900,000 workers have gotten what's called trade adjustment assistance benefits. That's the benefits you get from the government if your job's shipped overseas. And those 900,000 are due to NAFTA alone. We think the number is actually a lot bigger than that because a lot of workers, like call center workers, for much of the time in that program have not been eligible. And other workers may not know that they're eligible, or they may simply not be able to show. If you're trying to deal with getting your life together after your job's been shipped away, you may not have the wherewithal to figure out what exactly happened to it. At the same time, we've seen a dramatic expansion in our trade deficit with Mexico in specific. We had a pretty even trade balance, and now we have a trade deficit of almost $60 billion per year with Mexico. That's largely just because companies have found that in Mexico, workers are denied rights. They have very low wages, very few protections, and so they realize that if they move jobs there, they can increase their profits by exploiting Mexican workers. And so we've seen this effect all throughout the economy, And I think, certainly we do, we have to have trade with the world, right? We can't, including with Mexico, including with Canada, but we need to have it if we want to create jobs, we need to do it in a way that is structured to create jobs and to benefit workers.
Mm-hmm. Do you look at NAFTA, which, so now NAFTA is about 25 years old, give or take.
Right.
Has it affected how has that affected the ability of U.S. unions to organize? Has it hurt them drastically?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting question that far too often gets overlooked because the job losses themselves are very important, but we also need to see what happens to other workers, right? And we see this at CWA very often. Increasingly our members, whether they be in manufacturing or at call centers or elsewhere, their jobs can be done anywhere. And when we're negotiating, where we're trying to get a new contract, if we're trying to get better wages or we're trying to get better benefits and pensions and health care, at some point companies say, well, you know what, if you want all of that, then what we're going to do is we're going to move jobs to a place where we can exploit workers a lot better, like Mexico. And NAFTA has really facilitated that. And I think that's actually, we've seen that in a systematic way. There was a really interesting study out of Cornell University that found that threats to send jobs overseas in the face of union organizing drives tripled after NAFTA went into effect, which makes some sense because NAFTA greases the skids for companies to move jobs to lower wage countries. And so when we get pitted against workers in other countries, that makes it very hard for unions to organize and bargain and create better benefits, even though, what we know is those workers are not our enemy, right? It's the companies are trying to pit us against one another, but they've been very successful at doing it, and you see that in the drop in the rates of unionization and in the wage stagnation you've seen throughout the economy.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and also serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee. So 25 years ago, NAFTA was a pretty well-intended trade deal, Dan, was it not? But how much has technology affected NAFTA and kind of all of a sudden made it, not such a great thing?
I think in the concept of trying to work together with Mexico and Canada, that conceptually is a really great thing. I think I think the rules of the road are really important because if you set the rules wrong, you're not going to get a good result. But on technology, and I think that's part of the problem with NAFTA. But on technology, and in particular, you see the automation and offshoring actually go hand in hand. People often argue about, well, did you lose jobs due to automation? Did you lose jobs due to offshoring? And we know that the real answer is both. We see huge trade deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's not a direct result of automation. That can't be right. So that offshoring we know plays a role. At the same time, we know that in a lot of factories, for example, you can have just a few workers doing the work that maybe 20 workers would have been doing 20 years ago. But one thing that we see that's really important that ties all this together is that when you have this threat of companies being either themselves threatening to offshore jobs to countries with low wages, or facing competition from companies that do that, they need to cut costs. And so it encourages automation. And as technology has picked up, you end up seeing that these threats of automation and offshoring are oftentimes end up having a sort of symbiotic relationship where the two things are not, it's not a question of did automation cause your problems or did a bad trade deal cause your problems, but often the two really worked hand in hand to take away bargaining power from workers.
And something else, what about the environmental and health effects of NAFTA in Central America? Yeah,
that's actually something that is really an underrated aspect of it. We see NAFTA sets up these special tribunals that allow companies to challenge laws that they don't like. In practice, those are often environmental or public health laws, and sometimes labor laws as well. And that's one of the main points I was making in terms of NAFTA being set up to benefit the interests of multinational corporations, not workers. And we've seen that there's been a lot of research showing that these tribunals create a chilling effect on companies wanting to create public interest laws. They also have been used many times throughout Central America to, especially by mining companies that want to create mines that are going to have really damaging effects on the water supplies and clean water, and so that's a really big problem. Because if you can't set up good rules to protect clean water, you're going to see a lot of direct impacts. The other thing is that NAFTA has had really, really weak environmental standards. And what that means is that you get a race to the bottom, not just in terms of worker rights, but also in terms of environmental standards. So there's a lot of goods where we've in the U.S., for example, we've set better standards on lead in a lot of processes and products, and Mexico's standards are about only 1/10 as good, so you can have 10 times as much lead. And as you see some of these industries move to Mexico, you see high lead contamination, and you see really negative impacts on the public health of kids there, for the same reason that you see problems with lead in Flint and other communities across our country, even with our somewhat better standards. So it's I think the interests of workers go hand in hand with the interests of people who care about the environment, as far as NAFTA is concerned.
Yeah. Now, in general, you, of course, advocate for workers' rights to be as globalized as is the capital that moves across borders. But how would that work or even be enforced?
Absolutely. That's something that has really arisen more recently as a major point, as we've seen how companies have used trade agreements to pit workers in one country against another. What we see in NAFTA, for example, is that companies have the same rights to move if they open up a factory in Canada, the U.S., or in Mexico. You don't have much in the way of labor standards at all, but to the extent you do have labor standards in other trade deals, they tend to only be concerned with just how are labor standards doing in this country. They're doing okay. Okay, how are labor standards doing in another country? But you don't have rights guaranteed for workers to organize across companies, across countries. At CWA, we represent workers at AT&T, for example. AT&T has numerous call centers opened up in Mexico, some of them serving the U.S. Our vision is that we should be able to work with the few independent unions in Mexico that do represent workers' interests, and we should be able to bargain together to advance our interests with AT&T. I think you can write those guarantees right into the trade agreement. You can say that if you have operations in both countries as a company, you have to respect the rights of workers to bargain together. And we've seen that in practice happen at times, but there's no guarantee by law that CWA works very closely with Las Telefonistas, which is one of the few independent unions in Mexico. The United Steelworkers, one of America's other great unions, works very closely with Los Mineros, one of the other few independent unions. But we don't have legal protections for those relationships, so that really is why we think that those should be guaranteed in a fully enforceable way in a new NAFTA.
Now, globalization, Dan, is not something that can nor should be stopped. But do we need laws and treaties to make it fairer for workers, or perhaps a new template of technological, educational, or economic change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that question. Globalization is here to stay, and done right, it can be a benefit and bring people together and help raise wages and create jobs all over the world if we take advantage of all of our different strengths and work with people across countries. But I think that it's been shown that the current model hasn't worked, and it's had really bad economic effects, and it's also had bad political effects here in the U.S. as well as elsewhere. So I think what we need to do is come up with a new framework that puts the interests of workers first in trade agreements. And then when we do that, we can see that will benefit workers here in the U.S. and here and throughout the world. But until we do that, we're going to keep on seeing these threats of, if the question is pitted of the status quo or just trying to cut off globalization altogether, I think you're going to see this continued interest in cutting off globalization altogether, which is why we really need some real strong laws and protections that protect the interests of workers.
Okay. Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee, our guest today on americasdemocrats.org. Dan, we appreciate your time with us, and we do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome, and thanks for being with us. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up, Communications Workers of America's Dan Maurer gives us a worker's point of view on trade deals. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Every decade or so, America's mass media are surprised to discover that migrant farm workers are still being miserably paid and despicably treated by the industry that profits from their labor. Stories run, the public is outraged again, assorted officials pledge action, then nothing changes. News reports recently have redocumented that the shameful abuse of these hard-working, hard-traveling families continues. A Los Angeles Times report revealed that even if they receive the legal minimum wage, many farm laborers earn less than $17,500 a year because of the low pay and the seasonal nature of their work. Moreover, they're often housed in shacks, old chicken coops, shipping containers, and squalid motels. This year, though, multi-billion-dollar agribusiness interests from Florida to California are uniting in a push for new assistance, not for workers, but themselves. While they back Trump for president, many are now expressing shock that he may actually try to fulfill his campaign promise to cut off the flow of undocumented immigrants to their fields. They now admit that these immigrants make up as much as 70% of the industry's workforce. So they've rushed to Washington, demanding a special exemption from their president's planned lockout of Mexican laborers. In the process, they've suddenly recharacterized the very migrants they've been so callously mistreating as noble employees who are essential to the USA's food security. This is Jim Hightower saying Big Ag deserves no special break at all. But if Trump and Congress give any help to them, they should be required to pay a living wage, provide decent family housing and health care, and treat all farm workers with the respect due to people who really are essential to our food security. To help push for basic human justice, connect with the United Farm Workers at ufw.org.
If you like these feisty pops of populism that Hightower zings out on the airwaves, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter provides the in-depth lowdown on what the greed heads of Wall Street and the boneheads of Washington are doing to us behind the scenes. With Hightower's saucy Texas humor and truth-telling populist perspective, the lowdown literally can lift you up. And get this, you can have the lowdown delivered to your mailbox or email each month for only $15 a year. Yes, 12 issues, only $15. Check it out, hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The latest round of talks over the North American Free Trade Agreement took place under the shadow of President Trump's tariffs and how they will impact the negotiations. But Dan Maurer says the more important conversation about NAFTA is how it can put workers first. And we say hello to Celine McNicholas, serves as labor counsel at the Economic Policy Institute and a core member of EPI's Perkins Project on worker rights and wages, a policy response team that tracks the Trump administration's wage and employment policies. Before joining EPI in 2017, she served as Director of Congressional and Public Affairs and as Special Counsel for the National Labor Relations Board. Celine McNicholas, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. You know, last month, the Supreme Court heard arguments in Janus versus AFSCME, and it's a case that could prevent, of course, public sector unions from collecting partial fees from those who choose not to join. It's a case that the unions fear could profoundly affect their ability to improve wages and working conditions for public sector employees. So remind us how this case came about.
Sure. This case is the result of a number of lawsuits that have been working their way up through the appellate courts the last few years that have been financed essentially by a small group of foundations with ties to some of the most powerful corporate lobbies. So while we're talking about Janus today, I think that it's important to sort of remember that this same issue, as you just highlighted, whether it violates the First Amendment for a state and a union to essentially agree that public sector workers who are represented by the union can be required to contribute their fair share of the cost of that representation. It's been before the court a number of times in 2 other cases in the last 5 years. And if you think about that, that's a significant expenditure of money to have 3 cases essentially asking, the same question of the court in a 5-year time period. That's a significant investment. And, neither of those previous cases produced the result that essentially the corporate interest financing the litigation wanted. So here we are with our third case with Janus, where I think the conventional wisdom is that unfortunately those corporate interests are going to get their way in court on this case.
Mm. Now, the organization you work for, the Economic Policy Institute, filed a friend of the court brief on behalf of AFSCME. What did that say?
So actually, the Economic Policy Institute did not file the brief, but there was a brief that was filed by a number of economists. And I think that may be the one that you're talking about, where they make a series of economic arguments about the impact of fair share fees. And essentially that brief, and I think it was over 24 economists who ultimately signed on to that amicus brief, argue that there's overwhelming evidence that establishes that, workers who pay fair share fees, as opposed to those who elect to pay union dues, are not necessarily objecting to the union, but instead they're really truly free riders. They're not having some sort of ideological objection to a union. They instead are just sort of not they're recognizing, hey, we value the benefit, but we know that we can get the benefit without paying the full price. And so we're going to do that. We're not, coming down totally against unions, saying that, we are on total principle grounds not going to join the union. We just recognize there's a cheaper way of getting the same benefit. So why not take advantage of that essential discount? That's the argument that the economists are making, that this is not really something that individual workers choose based on, often on ideological grounds, as sort of the plaintiffs in this case are arguing, but instead a long-established economic principle that I think we can all relate to, right? That if you see someone getting the same benefit that you are, higher wages, good health care coverage, a pension, an advocate if your employer acts unfairly, and they're not paying for that benefit, why would you? And that's essentially what that brief lays out, and I think makes a very compelling case that this is something that is far more grounded in sort of simple individual economic principles than necessarily always the ideological argument that the plaintiffs want to have the case center on.
Which, and to me, it sounds like some people are just scamming the system the way that it's set up, right? I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense, even if you don't sort of, put the motives of, wanting to sort of take something from another person. I think if you just look about it in the instance of an individual teacher, let's say that you've got, a teacher in a classroom and, she sees that the teacher next door, right, as I just said, is getting the same, benefit, the wages, the healthcare, all of that, but is not contributing to those benefits, then there's a strong economic incentive to just sort of say, well, I'm not going to pay that either. And that's where that sort of contagious effect of all of this, that's, I think, at the heart, one of the greatest threats to this, that it's inherently against sort of workers' collective action to sort of pit them against one another, by sort of having somebody get something that you essentially then feel that you're being exploited by paying for it. And, it goes against the heart of, what collective action and worker solidarity is all about. And there's no mystery why this case has been, and this issue has been so important to these, sort of powerful corporate lobbies, because it does really get at the heart of collective action, in my view.
Now, you and your colleague, Janelle Jones, have written that black women will be disproportionately affected by this case. How so?
So black women have the highest share, or compose the highest share of workers in the public sector. And the share of public sector workers, they're even higher than in the population. So black women are going to be disproportionately hurt by weakened public sector unions. And this is even, worse than just sort of saying, hey, this is going to have a disproportional impact on this community. This is actually one of those instances where black women who traditionally face a double pay gap, both a gender and a racial wage gap, have a benefit here because unions help to reduce those pay gaps. So for black women in particular, because of their overrepresentation in the public sector, a weakened public sector union is going to impact those good middle-class jobs in the public space that have benefited black women in particular who have selected these public service careers. It's one of those avenues where black women are able to achieve, a middle-class position.
We're speaking with Celine McNicholas, who serves as labor counsel at the Economic Policy Institute and a core member of EPI's Perkins Project on worker rights and wages. Your organization also did some very important research to find out who is bankrolling the case against AFSCME. What did you find out?
So as I mentioned, there's essentially this small group of foundations that are propped up by money from some of the most powerful corporate lobbies, and they have familiar names like the Koch, brothers, and the Walton family, and then some less familiar names like the Bradley Foundation. And, one thing that's very clear, and this is nothing new, in this sort of moment, is that these wealthy foundations operate with very little transparency. It's very difficult to find out, who's spending money where, financing what cause. What we can say is that it has been a dedicated effort in this instance to advance this attack on public sector, unions. And we break out some of the organizations and provide a little bit more detailed information on, some of the small family foundations. But again, it's very, very difficult to sort of track what's going on with some of this money. They're so lacking in transparency that it's quite frankly frightening that they could have this kind of large scale public impact.
They play this great shell game, it seems, in many different sectors.
They absolutely do. I mean, it's the same groups that are advancing, anti-public sector, legislation, anti-collective bargaining in the public sector. There are folks who were behind Act 10 in Wisconsin. It's sort of the ALEC, legislating model. The same groups are financing all of this. It's an incredibly orchestrated, and we can only tell a small fraction of what's actually going on. So, I think what you can absolutely say is that this is a real concerted effort to sort of attack fundamental, labor and employment rights of working people in this country.
Yeah. Now, Celine, based on what you've heard in arguments in the case, do you have a sense of how the court may be leaning?
So, as I mentioned before, this issue has been before the court in the last several years and did not produce the desired result of sort of the corporate interest. So in my view, this is one of those cases that made it so important for Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans to block President Obama's nominee to the Supreme Court. I think that this is, the third time is the charm, and with a court composed, with a Republican essential nominee, I hold out little hope that, unions will prevail. That said, I absolutely think that the union and the state of Illinois made sharp and compelling, arguments about why 40 years of precedent should not be overturned in this matter. And so it'll be really interesting to see the gymnastics that the court's going to have to undertake to overturn that long-standing precedent, particularly in a court controlled by originalists.
If the court decides against AFSCME, could this have impact on the labor movement beyond the public sector? And if so, what type?
Sure. I mean, I think the court's ruling in Janus is going to have far-reaching implications for, not only public sector workers, but for all unionized workers. But for me, it really even goes beyond, the impact on unions. To me, this is really a case that's about whether we're going to allow a small group of wealthy donors and corporations to essentially rewrite our nation's most fundamental labor and employment rules, and really at the expense of the public good. Because this attack on public sector workers is also an attack on the critical services that they provide all of our communities. So attacking their, wages and benefits only hurts, the child care that we have in our communities, care for aging parents. These are the workers who keep our streets clean, keep us safe. So, degrading their, standard of living, those jobs really degrades the sort of public space in which we all live, and the folks paying for this litigation, they don't live in the same world as the rest of us. They're not worried about, a municipal trash pickup or, being able to piece together funding so that somebody gets a meal to their parents that are aging and not able to get out of the house. Like, this is something that impacts all of us, and the folks who are financing it, this is just attacking workers is just one element of it. It's also this sort of attack on what kind of public services we can all depend on in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Celine McNicholas, serving as labor counsel at the Economic Policy Institute, also a core member of EPI's Perkins Project on worker rights and wages, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Celine, we appreciate your time with us today, and we look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Democratic strategist Adam Parkhomenko.
Democrats very happy about a big, strong showing in the Texas primary. More Democrats turning out to vote in Texas than have turned out for decades. It's got the Republicans scared about what that might mean in the fall with a strong Democratic candidate up against Ted Cruz. On that front and many other, battles facing the Democrats face and challenges in this 2018 midterms. We welcome to the program Adam Parkhomenko, who is a Democratic strategist, former Democratic advisor to our nominee, Hillary Clinton. Hello,
Good to be
Adam.
with you. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. What happened in Texas?
I was going to say the last time I was on your show, I had hair, and you and Pat Buchanan were together.
Oh, my God. It's been that long ago?
It's been a long time.
Yeah, about that.
Lots happened
Texas was
since
incredible. I think, Texas is one of these places where folks kind of look at Texas and Arizona and figure, which is going to go completely blue first. But between early vote and absentee, we saw a lot of what we saw in Virginia in 2017, which is just incredible numbers coming out.
Right. So, over a million. These were not that they won every race, right? But the turnout, just the energy and the momentum, is clearly on the Democratic side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
is there a real ground operation, or is it just Trump has pissed people off so much?
I think it's a little bit of both. It depends on what state you're in. I think at the end of the day, I sort of joke until the Democratic Party completely gets everything together, and maybe that will never happen.
No, we're Democrats.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. People are stepping up and they're coming out all over the place, and they're doing it. And whether they just had a kid and they didn't vote, and they've sort of kind of woken up and they're thinking about the future. I think the most telling moment coming out of Texas was the fact that Ted Cruz is finally acknowledging he's got a serious race on his hands. A year ago, he said that anyone who's talking about their opponent is scared, and the first thing he does, coming out of the election results of the primary is he's hitting his opponent for his name.
Yeah, right.
I love the idea that he's hitting on Beto O'Rourke for his name.
I love the name, by the way.
Yeah, and his name is Roberto O'Rourke, I guess is his real name. But as many other people have pointed out, Ted Cruz is not his actual name. His name is Rafael Edward Cruz.
Yeah, I think it took Ted Cruz a few minutes on CNN to actually explain what his name was.
Yeah, his name's not Ted Cruz either. It's Rafael Cruz. He's named after his father.
I think we also learned with Barack Obama.
Yeah. Barack Hussein Obama.
Right. That you can have a pretty weird name and you can still make it. Yeah. I remember the first time I heard about Barack Obama when I called friends of mine in Chicago because there was somebody else, I forget, who was running for the Senate there. And they said, no, we're supporting a guy named Barack Obama. And I just laughed and I said, forget it with that name.
Yeah. And someone recently thanked
he could never make it, right?
Thanked him and gave this kind of tribute to him. And they said, I'd like to thank Hussein Barack Obama.
Jeez.
Tell us about, or if you know, I don't know anything about Beto O'Rourke. Member of Congress, right?
Yeah, I think the key here with him is that what he did was he got out there and he got out there early and he did this tour throughout the country. He made himself known. He paved a way. And key here is in a lot of states, including somewhere like Arkansas, where we really, as Democrats, have no seats left, we need to build a party around somebody. Yeah. And I think in Texas that's what they're doing. And they also have some other good candidates running for AG and a statewide commissioner. But that's what he did. He traveled the country, and the grassroots got excited and fired up about him. And, I think Democrats are really smart, and they kind of stepped back and got and coalesced around somebody. Didn't waste a ton of money in the primary, and they're setting up for a strong general. And we've seen these races before. I mean, it's been a long time, but Gary Morrow was elected statewide a long time ago back in Texas, and ultimately ran against a guy named George Bush. But Texas is fired up, and I think that if you look at statewide, Hillary won a number of the congressional districts that the GOP carried. She won a number of the state Senate and state House districts. They're competing for these judgeships, so they're competing in every corner of the state. Yeah, and we remember it wasn't that long ago that Texas was a solid blue state and one that Democrats really counted on, right? Could count on.
I believe next Tuesday is the primary in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so
which is maybe the next big test, right?
Yeah, so the special election of Connor Lamb in PA 12, where we had a disgraced Republican who stepped down and opened up that seat. I think that'll be an interesting one. You know, I can't quite tell, and I think a lot of folks can't, on whether or not that will be a bellwether. To date, since Donald Trump took office, Democrats have, of all the seats that have flipped, Democrats have flipped 39 seats.
Yeah.
Republicans have flipped 4. So, you know, over 91% of the seats that have flipped have gone towards Democrats. That's one district where, even with this big win on the gerrymandering case, the lines will not be redrawn prior to the date. However, the other ones will. But, you know, Connor's out there, and he's running the race that he wants to run, and he was overwhelmingly selected at the convention, and I think he's got a real shot. And the Washington Post had a great article recently about how the Republicans have really failed to land a blow against him.
Failed to land a blow against him, and what I've read, too, is Republicans are not real happy with their nominee. I forget.
Right.
Member of Congress, I guess?
I'm not too familiar with him, but that's a good thing, you know?
Yeah,
we know
exactly.
Connor Lamb's name and can't think of the opponent's name, and I think
But this is a Republican district.
It's a ruby red district, and
that was drawn as a Republican
exactly.
district. Yeah,
and there's parts that we did really well in the 2016 presidential parts of the district. However, he's got to carry it, and I think that he's got a real shot on his hands here.
Right. So if you look at the midterms, we've done the numbers so many times. Democrats need to pick up 24 or 20. Yeah, 24. There are 23 seats held by Republicans now that Hillary Clinton actually carried those districts. And the average loss for president in the first midterms is 43.
Yeah.
So is it a slam dunk that Democrats take back the House this year?
I don't think anything's a slam dunk. My business partner repeatedly jokes with me that I think it's actually 24 seats that she carried, and it's always reported as 23, but when it was all said and done and they counted the absentee ballots and other things like that, there were 24 districts. I think that if you look at places that we might not otherwise be competitive that aren't those districts, we are. And that's, for instance, I've nicknamed him Dirty Devin, the Kremlin Gremlin, Nunes. Andrew Jans took off. He did huge. When the memo came out, the memo really set his campaign on fire. That's a district right there that shouldn't be on the map. So I think we can never take anything for granted, but what we have is incredible candidates. I think one of the concerns among Democrats, we saw this in Texas, is to what extent does the D-Trip get involved and try to pick a candidate from Washington where folks want to pick a candidate in their state. At the same time, in California, we have a couple of districts where we could potentially have 2 Republicans going into the runoff because of the jungle primary. But I think as we get closer to primary day in California, that won't be an issue. So I think that we'll take back the House. I hope we take it back by far more than those seats. But no one will take anything for granted.
Well, California, you're based in California?
No, I'm based out of D.C.
D.C. California could very well decide.
That's what's
what
so
happens,
remarkable
right?
about this.
No, it is. And parts of California, as former Democratic chair of California, right, I find it extremely interesting following this because the potential exists to pick up seats in California in areas which we always considered verboten almost, right? Like we called it behind the orange curtain.
Right.
But if you look at Orange County now, Darrell Iss's district, there are 3 or 4.
There's a ton of them.
Dana Rohrabacher.
Yeah. So Rohrabacher, I mean, there's a candidate I work for, to be transparent, but Harley Ruda is an incredible candidate out there in the 48th. 49th, Mike Levin has had a ton of energy. He went to a debate recently, and none of the opponents on the other side of the aisle appeared there. And he's just had and so I kind of joke with my friends in California that while I hope the night is decided very early on the East, I will, very happily stay up and see how far we can push the majority as the results come in from the West.
And Nunes, I forget the number of his district, but he's...
Nunes, 22.
22, right. But do you really think that that's a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. What's really interesting here
is... it should be. He's such a
And he's got a serious fight on his hands now because the candidate running against him is the local prosecutor. He's a Democrat. He's well respected. He's gained national attention after the memo came out. And as he jokes, everyone in the district wants to know how a dairy farmer became a Russian lapdog.
Yeah. Too bad I'm not out there still as Democrats. We'll have a lot of fun this time.
It is. I just got back from the San Diego statewide convention. It was, they are strong out there and they're fired up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The big news, of course, was the failure of Dianne Feinstein to get the endorsement of the party.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. I actually don't know how much that affects things at the end of the day, obviously, but I think
I don't think that much, to tell the truth.
Statewide.
Yeah.
I think activists made a point to her, but as we saw with a number of the congressional districts, the problem is the farther down the chain you get, 22 or 23 people are making a decision on whether someone gets an endorsement. Obviously not statewide, but for the congressionals. And I think if you look at the 2016 presidential, no matter what side you were on, and all of the discussions we had about the superdelegates, people are sick and tired of 20 people in a back room making a decision on who the nominee is. Mm-hmm. And so people came out of there that were endorsed by the party running for Congress that I think ultimately will not be the nominee on the Democratic side as well.
Right. What do you think are going to be the deciding issues in 2018? And to what extent will the Mueller investigation be one of them, or will that be the primary one?
I think USA Today just had a poll recently that it was 1,000 voters where 5 registered voters said that the Russia investigation was, what motivated them for the poll. So I think everyone's paying attention. Everyone's fired up about what's going on. It's becoming more and more clear every single day. Someone joked online yesterday when some of this other news came out that was almost like a corner piece of the puzzle as it's starting to fill in. But, I think for some folks it's a single issue, and I think for some folks it's...
But if only 5 out of 1,000 said that the Mueller investigation they were concerned about it?
Well, it wasn't that they were concerned about it. It was that's the issue they're voting around, I believe.
Yeah.
And so I think for people, look, guns are a huge issue right now. These teenagers in Florida are incredible. I hope not only that are they able to help make some real progress on this once and for all, but that these students aren't going to be single issue students too, because I actually think these students have the ability to get a whole bunch of different things done. That with the incredible bullpit they have now, and healthcare, there's a number of things. But I think at the end of the day too, a lot of which that happened in 2016 has carried over, and I think people are fired up in general to take their country back. I mean, we have somebody in here who cannot implement Russia sanctions. It's almost there's almost no party lines for those of us that have been around a long time nowadays. Especially on like the political hack side. I look forward to the day where I can work hard against the John Weavers and Stuart Stevens and Rick Wilsons and Amanda Carpenters of the world again, because we're all on the same side now.
Well, do you think that 2018 will in effect be a referendum on Trump?
I think 2018 will be a moment in our country's history of which everyone has 2, 3, 4 big defining moments in their life. In my lifetime, I think one of the biggest moments that I've lived through was 9/11. And I think that the 2016 presidential campaign woke a lot of people up to how incredibly important it is to protect the institutions of our country, how important their vote is, that so many people fought for, that many didn't even utilize. And so I think there's just so many different things that go into people's thinking. But the key here is that, I'll give you one example from Virginia. Tom Perriello ran for governor and lost, and Susan Platt, former Joe Biden chief of staff, ran for lieutenant governor and lost in 2017. The two of them separately received more votes individually than any Democratic primary statewide in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and still lost. But that's how many people came out and vote.
Yeah, Right. So maybe, I mean, I find this encouraging in that we're really getting back to the importance and the power of grassroots organizing.
Absolutely. And I think, and I say this all the time, the DNC needs to get back to the Howard Dean days and focus on what is important to them. There's 3 things in their rules and bylaws that run them. That is supporting state parties and local parties, supporting presidential primaries, and doing the presidential debates. That's it. So they are supposed to be a resource to everyone else out there. And the key here is, how do we best support our states? Every single state is different. Within each state, it's different. And so I don't think, given where we are right now in 2018, that the deciding factor of how well we do on the ground is going to be the national parties. I think it's going to be how quickly can people continue to organize on their own. They're being creative. They're working together. But with all of these different groups that have come up, we just need to make sure that people are able to connect and not overlap and be doing the same thing. But at the end of the day, I think this is going to be the American people, not any single one of the two parties.
It's the American people working through. I mean, I have the feeling, tell me if I'm wrong, that so much of the creativity and the initiative and the energy is coming not from the party, but from collectively, I guess, the resistance. But organizations like Emily's List, organizations like Our Revolution, Progressive Change Campaign Committee, Indivisible. I mean,
it's exactly what it is.
There's one called
Swing Left, Indivisible, PCCC.
Something about running. Why did it,
Run for Something?
Run for Something, right?
And that's totally true. I mean, and it's, what's interesting to me is,
they're out there. I hear from them all. I think I'm on the mailing list of every one of them, right? And they've got candidates, and they're really hustling.
And there's no turf wars. And I think that's the big thing. I actually think that one of the biggest, I don't know if it's a challenge, but I think one of the ways that Tom Perez can be most helpful is within legal limits, really bringing everyone to the table and making sure that the DNC is being the best resource to those groups that it can.
How can we help you?
Exactly.
Right.
But let them do what they're doing. And I was the founder of Ready for Hillary, and that was a really successful effort. But the only reason it was successful was because all we did was provide people with the resources they were asking for.
I know there's one race in Texas, I forget which one, I haven't followed it that closely, where people are concerned because there were 2 Democratic candidates, sort of a Hillary person and a Bernie person. And I don't think that's been resolved. I'm not sure how it turned out. But my question is the party still stuck on the 2016 primary split?
No, I don't think so. But I think it depends on what state you're in and what area you're in. Obviously, some states are were a little more divided than others, and some of those are the caucus states. If you look at sort of like a Nebraska or a Wisconsin or an Oregon, I think the race that you're referring to, I had a client in, and that was Texas 7, Culberson. And what was interesting there that was actually the race that the DCCC came out and personally attacked Laura Mosier.
Right.
And if you look at the numbers,
who was the progressive or the more progressive, the Bernie candidate?
Absolutely.
They're both good people, but one was Hillary and one was Bernie.
Right.
Yeah.
But in that district, you just had folks that were running as Democrats. But what was really interesting there was I think people were more pissed off that the DCCC got involved and attacked her than anything else, because what you had was my client, Dr. Jason Weston, was actually going to go into the runoff. If you look at the numbers and you look at the early vote and absentee numbers and you compare Lizzie and Laura, the two were far apart. But the vote broke after what the DCCC did. The DCCC completely backfired, and ultimately the candidate that the DCCC attacked, they pushed into the runoff. And so that's really where the divide was. But the divide was not who was with who. And actually, in terms of Bernie supporters and Hillary supporters from the primary, they've come together long ago, and they work hand in hand in Texas very well.
I mentioned earlier, I was at the Gridiron Dinner last Friday night, where Mitch Landrieu was Peter, I forgot to mention, by the way, that in his remarks, Donald Trump kept calling him Rich.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh.
We're such good friends. He's a Democrat and a Republican. We're really good friends. Isn't that right, Rich? Yeah, right.
The only thing that Donald Trump can do is come up with really incredibly good names that stick.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's his talent.
I listened to wondering why nobody near him or alongside him just said Mitch, not right, but nobody did. But
what I want to know is what all the names that Donald Trump has for the people around him that he doesn't share.
I like to know too. I guess my question is, there was a lot of buzz, and he did a great job, and a lot of buzz in that room about, maybe he's the guy we need in 2020. Do you think anybody outside of Washington, do you see anybody on the horizon outside of Washington who could emerge in 2020?
I'm going to probably not get the names here, but first of all, Mitch Landrieu's incredible. The governor of Washington State,
Jay Inslee.
Yep. Jay Inslee is incredible, and he can talk about a number of different issues and translate into a way that it affects anyone in any corner of the state. The former mayor of Phoenix. I actually think the farther west you go, the more incredible candidates and talent that the Democratic Party has that are really stepping up and shining, and I think it's anyone's ballgame here.
I would add Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, to that list as well.
Garcetti came out in San Diego to speak, and he talked about South Carolina 4 times.
Hey, Adam, great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Celine McNicholas, Dan Maurer, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.